Hello, everyone, and welcome in. We've got a little bit of Thursday afternoon breaking news here. There has been a quarterback decision made in the 2025 recruiting cycle. I guess there is white smoke coming from, much like they would formally choose the Pope. Matt Zollers, a name that Georgia fans have known. Georgia has been recruiting him hard. Has made his decision, and it is not the Georgia Bulldogs. He, in fact, ends up committing to Missouri. This has been, I think, a quick-moving recruitment here for Georgia. Georgia did get the last visit here, and he still ends up going to Missouri, stays in the SEC. Georgia will likely at some point see him during his college career, depending on what happens with the schedule here moving forward. But BA, we go to you. Quarterback recruiting has been something that's been talked about quite often this offseason, and I think this is just another sort of bump in the road in terms of where things have gone for Georgia when it comes to finding a quarterback in this 2025 cycle.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting a moment ago watching the ceremony of the X platform. Zollers, high school coach, in trying to instruct the media how to pronounce his name, says it's Zollers like dollars. And I think that's probably figuratively true as well in this situation, because I think for a lot of Georgia fans, this is certainly a story that's going to rhyme with Williams Winery a year ago and Luther Burden the year before that. Missouri probably does not have the financial resources to fully compete with Georgia, but it certainly can put all of its chips into the middle of the table for a big prospect. And now 3 years in a row, it seems like that's indeed going to be the case here. Missouri has had, very aggressive NIL laws. I'm not even sure that matters as much anymore because it doesn't seem like there's much in the way of rule to be enforced. But Missouri has wanted to give itself every NIL advantage it could. And my assumption is, and perhaps this is an excessively pro-Georgia perspective, my assumption is, if a player like this chooses Missouri over Georgia, NIL seemingly has to be the reason, right? Because Missouri is not a program on the same plane with UGA otherwise. So for all the people who seemingly like to celebrate, and I'm taken back to Kirk Herbstreit when Dylan Raiola chose Nebraska, for the people who like to celebrate the fact that NIL in some respects has leveled the playing field in some recruitments, to me, this is going to feel like another example of that to a lot of people, I believe.
And I agree with you there. Before I bring on Jeff Sentell, I want to play a clip from Kirby Smart's press conference on Tuesday because, sort of reading the tea leaves, covering the team, covering this recruitment, that NIL is going to be a factor in quarterback recruiting and Juju Lewis, and we'll bring Jeff on to talk about what comes next. But I find Kirby's answer here to be very interesting in one regard and also not all that surprising. So here's what Kirby Smart said when he was asked point blank, what kind of impact does NIL have on quarterback recruiting in particular?
I don't know if I fully understand the question. How does NIL tie to quarterback recruiting?
Yeah. How has NIL impacted how you guys go about recruiting quarterbacks?
I don't know that it's changed. I mean, we go about recruiting quarterbacks by evaluating quarterbacks. We watch them play high school. We bring them over here and have them throw for us. We watch their games, which is by far and away the most critical thing we can have. But I mean, it would probably be a bigger picture of why are we singling out quarterbacks, because NIL has impacted the recruitment of every player in terms of where does that rank on their scale. It's one of the first questions of is that number one priority? Is that number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? And do you list it that way because you actually feel that way, or you just think it's the right answer? It used to be, every kid came in and said, well, the most important thing to me is my education. Well, I don't know many universities you get a bad education at. They don't hand out bad educations. So is that truly what people were coming to school for 10, 15, 20 years ago? Is it truly what they're coming to school for now at NIL? So I'm dancing around the question because I don't really understand why specifically it's about quarterbacks. It hasn't, like, our recruitment of quarterbacks or any position hasn't changed what we look at because of NIL. It might change what their motivating factor is, certainly, but not what we look for in terms of criteria. I want a self-starter. I want a guy that's committed to the program, is selfless. I want all the same things, size, speed. I want all those same things. It's be more selective over kids you pick and choose from. That the NIL is not the number one narrative.
So, Jeff, I will bring you in here now, talking about what happened here. There we go. Got to figure it out. Doing a lot of different things here. Matt Zollers, rhymes with dollars. what happened here? Where does Georgia go next? What direction do you want to take this conversation in? How are things shaping up for the Bulldogs in 2025?
Yeah. Let me see. First off, guys, hopefully you guys can hear me. I got like a little waterfall in the background. I was in a hotel room and like the refrigerator freezer blew up. We had like 6 maintenance guys in my room. So it's kind of par for Brandon's head right now as he goes through his thought bubbles about what's happening at quarterback. Connor, I thought it was pretty funny. You stumbled on Zollers and then you said Zollers as in dollars. Guys, I really don't think this is a, Missouri money whipping Georgia to the punch here type thing. Because this kid, I will always remember Matt Zollers as a young man that like, he, to me, every time I hear a kid tell me, oh, this recruiting's so hard or it's just so hard to figure out, it wasn't really hard for Matt Zollers to figure out. He got his offers from Mizzou and Georgia, both in January. He visited those schools shortly thereafter. He's like, I'm going to go play some basketball. I'm going to shoot a bunch of threes. And then after I get through with that, I'm going to go visit them all again one more time. And then I'm going to make my decision like 2 days later. That's what he told me in February. And that's exactly what he did. He said, NIL's not a big deal. NIL's not a big deal to his family. It was the situation where he just wanted stability. He also wanted a place where, he knows that he would get that good feeling or whatever. And I think Georgia and Mizzou both offered that for him. I think the most radical thing about all this is today, and this is in the DawgNation story, is that not only was Zollers unconventionally methodical with his process, kind of like he's just going through a quarterback, going through 1, 2, 3, 4 reads on the field. He basically looked at this as, I'm committing to Mizzou. I like the people there. I like the fit there. He was drinking the Drinkowitz Kool-Aid, Brandon, if we're allowed to use that type of term on your airwaves here. But the thing that I will never understand about this, guys, it is April the 4th, and he is the only commitment in the Missouri recruiting class. He is the guy that they will build their own. And for this young man to see Mizzou and to see Mizzou, and maybe they can beat Georgia a little bit on the recruiting trail, Winery, Burden, I think those were NIL decisions. I don't think this was a heavy NIL decision. And now, also wanted to say, Connor, kudos on getting Kirby to say, I'm not dancing around your question. You got Kirby with a little bit of high stepping, a little bit at the podium like Deion Sanders, but the attention now turns to Julian Juju Lewis. I think I've said a couple times that this is going to feel like a soap opera. And now Ryan Montgomery out of Ohio. Those are the 2 quarterbacks that Georgia likes.
So, Jeff, let me ask you this, because I think, speaking from the perspective of a fan, I think it's going to be hard for a lot of fans to believe that this wasn't an NIL-driven recruitment, because what you have is a situation where we all acknowledge NIL is prevalent, but you also see very frequently it's still sort of taboo to talk about. Very few recruits ever come out and say, yeah, man, NIL is the biggest thing for me. Recruits are just conditioned to think they're not supposed to speak that way. And yet in the clip we hear from Kirby Smart, he essentially alludes to all recruits at least have some version of the NIL conversation, whether it's the most important thing for them or the 4th most important thing. It's still part of the conversation. So, I certainly understand where you're coming from. But, if Zollers says, no, I'm not worried about NIL, what I hear is the same thing that every recruit seems to always say. It's always seemingly somebody else who's worried about NIL, but never the recruit in question. And somehow that just doesn't quite line up with the prevalence of NIL overall in college football recruiting as a whole.
I guess it feels like algebra, Brandon. It's not NIL-X, it's NIL-3X. Like, as long as you're in the ballpark with everything else, I think that's what feels like the recruit wants. The thing with Zollers is, here's what happens a little behind the scenes type stuff is when they have that come to Kirby meeting, we'll use that term loosely, but when they have that come to Kirby meeting in his office after everything's been said, everything's been pitched, there's a few things, there's really only one thing a recruit can say, barring 7 figures in NIL here, that will say, Georgia can say, nah, we're good. And that's, I want to come in and play right away and start. That's the one thing that Kirby Smart, when he hears that from recruits, that they're like, nah, that's not going to happen here. This is the SEC, especially if you're on the line of scrimmage. They can deal with a little bit of NIL. They can deal with a lot of the other stuff. That's the one thing when that come to Kirby meeting that really Georgia's going to be like hard pass on a lot of that. I think the general fan is now going to go, well, hey, Jeff, you're talking about Zollers is not NIL, and Georgia did not win that recruitment. And now it means, well, everyone perceives that the Julian Juju Lewis recruitment will be a heavy recruitment, or it will at least take a substantial amount of non-collective NIL to kind of bring him to the table. I get what everybody's saying. I get what everybody's seeing there. I think it's also a little bit of opportunity. Maybe Zollers looks at Georgia and he goes, Gunner's there, Ryan Puglisi's there. Maybe the quarterback succession is a little bit murky. I've actually heard quarterback targets tell me that they're really looking hard at Georgia and waiting to see what Georgia does in the April portal in terms of, okay, I'll know Georgia's situation a little bit better, because if they're bringing in a veteran that's going to likely gun for the number 2 job this year and have a pole position on the starter spot next year, that's what they want to know.
Yeah, and, look, they almost had that level of clarity in January when they land Jaden Maeva, only he ends up at USC. And, look, USC, they've been very aggressive with NIL. I think they afford a lot of luxuries living out there in California. You saw, I think, what Caleb Williams was able to do with the NIL platform there. You look at what happened with Justice Terry. You look at where Juju Lewis is currently committed. The numbers there all sort of line up a little bit. I think spinning ahead, and Jeff, I think you're right to bring up the transfer portal window, April 16th to April 30th, and the impact that's going to have on it as well. What is Georgia doing at the quarterback position moving ahead into the 2025 recruiting cycle? Because I think because you don't have Dylan Raiola, you don't have a Jaden Maeva, you now have to take a quarterback in this class, even though you already have a Jared Curtis committed in the 2026 cycle. I think you need, from a body perspective, someone in this 2025 class. So who is that likely to be?
Yeah, for me, I think it probably lends more likely to a split between Lewis and Montgomery. I think the Lewis situation, guys, it may be a situation where Georgia has to up the ante a little bit on what type of NIL it's comfortable with. I mean, I'm not trying to be whimsical and funny here, but to answer your point, BA, I'd love to read a game story one time about a commitment breaking story that goes something along the lines of Jim Peters is a tax attorney in Kansas City. He got a call late last Friday that the collective needed some help. He had a great third quarter with his business, and he broke off an additional $200,000. And that's how School X came up with the chance to claim the commitment of so-and-so. Wouldn't that be reality TV type terms of commitment stories? I think Montgomery really likes the Dogs. I think Georgia looks at him and goes, that's a guy, you need to have a lot of numbers in the room. And they think Montgomery's a guy that would fit the Georgia playbook in terms, I don't need to play right away. I won't cause a lot of drama. But then you got to compare that with Julian Lewis, who I feel can somewhat look like a career that Bryce Young had at Alabama in the SEC. I think he's that talented. And I think this is an example.
Well, hopefully not Bryce Young, because that means no national championships.
Statistical stat line. I stand corrected. I think you would definitely take what Bryce Young did, running around from dogs in the SEC championship game and just having a little bit more pieces around him. I think he can be that type of passer. The intrigue here, guys, is he is still currently committed to USC. I've been told that he's still going to take a couple more official visits. He's still going to wait this thing out. I also don't think that this was a situation where Georgia, would go to a Lewis and go to Montgomery and say, hey, we're doing this. This guy wants in. I don't know if that would even have happened here if Matt Zollers chose Georgia. The other thing, Connor, I'm glad you brought up Jared Curtis. If we want to really cross hairs here, Georgia is looking for short-term futures at quarterback right now, somebody to maybe bridge between 2005 and 2007, because I've seen Jared Curtis. Jared Curtis is exactly the same caliber of prospect that Mizzou just won the day for today with their class. Curtis is going to play some football in the SEC, especially at the level of a prospect that Zollers commands right now.
So, Jeff, let me ask you about that, because that's a very important topic that you're kind of bumping up against there. So are we led to believe, because we never – I mean, obviously you have, better sources, but in terms of those of us who observe this, we never know the real story about some of these kinds of things. Today, if Zollers had announced Georgia, does that mean that Georgia essentially would have unfollowed Julian Juju Lewis, and he would not have taken an official visit here at the end of May, and the recruitment of Lewis would have stopped? Could Zollers today, with the announcement that he just made, if it was Georgia instead of Missouri, could that have ended the recruitment of Julian Lewis by Georgia if Zollers had chosen the Dogs today?
That's a good question. I'm going to give you my best answer to that, Brandon. I don't think so. I think if Zollers would have given Georgia a yes, a very hard yes, I think then Georgia would have went to Julian Lewis and said, what's happening here? Like, you're still our guy. what seems comfortable to you. That's what I feel is happening here behind the scenes. Of course, I can't substantiate that, but that's what I feel is happening behind the scenes in terms of, I think there was a pecking order. I think that pecking order, if you know football the way these coaches at Georgia do, and you look at the film, you're going to have to grade Lewis and what he's done in 7A Georgia football for back-to-back years. And you're going to say that's the guy that is more likely to start multiple years and maybe start year 2 at Georgia. But as we talked a lot on our shows and our platforms, Brandon, I think Julian is a little bit complicated. His own father has told me that he didn't even say that he felt it was psychologically wise for Julian to wait as long as Carson Beck did. He even didn't know it was possible. But then they have said that they would be willing to wait 1 year to start. And I don't think those are any type of parameters that Kirby Smart and Mike Bobo are comfortable with, or maybe they should be comfortable with, considering what they've built in Athens, not having to cater to one specific prospect's needs.
Because, Connor, I'd be curious to get your opinion on this. To me, and maybe this doesn't matter, perhaps it doesn't, it seems like Georgia's got a little bit of a PR mess to clean up with here, because Zollers has gotten a lot of attention. And Zollers apparently told another media outlet that Georgia told him he was the only quarterback they wanted. Well, if that's not true, then somehow, some way, Georgia's got to kind of recast that narrative, I think, a little bit. It's really interesting to me that Julian Lewis is the in-state quarterback. I would have thought his recruitment would take on a little bit more of a fever pitch than it has. Zollers has really gotten a lot of chatter as of late. Perhaps none of this really matters. It's all just, sort of good fodder for, internet shows. But it sort of seems like Georgia's kind of got to rebrand itself a little bit if now it really wants to go back in hard on Julian Lewis and say, hey, you were our guy all along, because I don't know. The events of the last 72 hours make it seem like, I don't know how true that really was.
It's very interesting in terms of what Georgia ultimately wants to do with Lewis. I believe if NIL were not a factor, I believe if playing time were not a factor, I believe if you got Kirby up there on the stand and he answered honestly, I think he would probably tell you that on talent alone, Juju Lewis would be the first choice. But in the age that we are living in, where NIL is a factor, where, as Jeff points out, wanting to get on the field is a factor, and team chemistry is a factor, I think that those are considerations that have to be taken into it there. And look, say what you want about Juju Lewis, say what you want about his right to command NIL money, but when you have his dad in February of 2023, saying, hey, my son is worth $500,000 going into at the time, his sophomore year of high school, that is a certain level of attention, and just quite frankly, in covering this program, that Georgia has not wanted to put up with. I believe that Georgia, when it comes to NIL and spending NIL in high school recruiting, they want to do so on the offensive line and on the defensive line. I believe that is the commitment they have been willing to make. And they have pointed to the success that, say, Stetson Bennett or Carson Beck have had once they become the starter in terms of how much money they are ultimately able to make. You understand with Lewis trying to get as much as he possibly can. You can understand that being a factor there. And Kirby Smart having to balance that all out there as well. But at the current moment, Georgia has some questions at the quarterback position. I think that, if they go out and land a capable player in the transfer portal, I think that might go a long way in answering some of the questions. But the other thing that is at least very interesting to me, Kirby Smart has been steadfast in making it clear that he wants 4 scholarship quarterbacks, when more often than not in his career, that hasn't necessarily been a requirement for him. And so it'll be interesting going forward just how much he wants to stick to that idea of having 4 scholarship quarterbacks, because I think they're going to try and get someone in that spring portal window that will get them there. But if you're willing, I think, perhaps to be more flexible and you're able to also land a caliber of transfer portal quarterback in the spring window, maybe then you don't feel the need to go get a 2025 quarterback and you roll with Gunnar Stockton, transfer portal quarterback X, and Ryan Puglisi, and then you have the bridge necessary for when Curtis gets here in the 2026 recruiting cycle.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I'd also caution too, and I think a lot of fans realize this, that, we have this picture of the transfer quarterback being Caleb Williams, who leaves Oklahoma and goes to USC, wins the Heisman Trophy. But the actual prototype transfer quarterback of late has been a little bit more, Peyton Thorne at Auburn, or, Graham Mertz at Florida. And Mertz actually didn't have that bad of a year, but it's still not a program-changing player. It's Spencer Sanders leaving Oklahoma State to go sit the bench at Ole Miss. I mean, there are a lot of veteran transfers who are moving around. More than half the quarterbacks in college football this year that start will probably be at one point in time transfers. But the actual impact transfer quarterback even with the proliferation of the transfer portal as wide as it is, there aren't as many game-changing transfer quarterbacks as you might think, given the huge number of total transfer quarterbacks that exist.
And to that point there, and I'll throw it to you, Jeff, after this, like quarterback right now is not a problem for Georgia because I think they've done a good job identifying and developing players that A, fit what they look for, but also B, have those necessary talents to help make them. Carson Beck, I've said it before. I think he's going to be the number one quarterback taken in next year's NFL draft. Gunnar Stockton is a guy who's had a good spring, and you talk to people around the program, they love this guy. He's everything that I think a Georgia fan wants a Georgia Bulldog to be. Ryan Puglisi could have gone to a lot of other places when Dylan Raiola was committed. He elected to remain at Georgia. So as it stands right now for the 2024 season, they're in a good spot. The problem, and look, BA, I think you and I have talked about this, it's just really hard now to forecast things multiple years out in terms of the way this sport is doing because of the transfer portal and whatnot. It is very uncertain in terms of what Georgia's quarterback future looks like moving on. And so I think with that regard in there, Jeff, taking a step into what this class looks like overall in 2025, Georgia a little bit lower right now, but I think as anyone will know, it's July and June rather, where a bunch of this class is going to come together. I know you're on location now. Georgia could be getting a commitment tomorrow. What do things look like for the Bulldogs moving forward in this 2025 class with Matt Zollers no longer being a part of it? And Jeff's on mute. So it's a classic DawgNation broadcast there.
Exactly. You can check that off your bingo card.
All right, Connor, you're the one controlling
the mic.
There we go. You're the one controlling the mic. Throwing your boy under the bus. Let's have some fun with this for a second, okay? And this is the reality I can spit right now. Does anybody know who Aiden Glover is? Have you ever heard of the name Aiden Glover? Aiden Glover is a 3-star quarterback that committed to Mizzou in 2024. He would be their Ryan Puglisi type quarterback. In my honest scouting opinion, I think Ryan Puglisi every bit is shown on film the type of stuff that Zollers has, especially when you throw in Puglisi's big arm and his dual sport athleticism. So I think in a lot of ways, this is Georgia looking at it. Is Zollers the type of guy that can just add depth to the room and feed the monster, and you're supposed to have 4 quarterbacks that anybody in the country would probably have in their top 2 in your room? I think that's what kind of this is with Puglisi and Stockton. I also feel that, Curtis is coming, but I also would say this to an earlier point. I think you're doing quarterback recruiting wrong if your top 3 targets don't all believe that they're at the top of the board. Is it disingenuous? No. But there is some wonderful Scooby-Doo ending to all this where there are 3 quarterbacks and there's a board in the University of Georgia's quarterback pecking order room right now, and there's 3 quarterbacks all at the top at number 1. That's a way that you can kind of say that and kind of save your face and not need to wage a PR campaign about it. I think if you ask me, the most likely, and this will probably turn some heads, maybe it'll even turn BA's head, but the most likely quarterback future for me is I think something happens and Georgia comes to an accord with Julian Lewis. I really think that's the most likely scenario going forward. Now, that's going to cause some consternation, and that's going to cause some people thinking, all right, how's this happening? But I think Georgia wants to bring in player assets, maybe perhaps under their financial terms, that can also move the room and that can also get on the field and play right away. And I think Julian Lewis has that ability. I just think it would be complicated to get there. If you had to ask me what's the most possible likely scenarios, kind of like Doctor Strange in Endgame, Connor, I know you'll probably get that 50 million variants, but I think Ryan Montgomery would probably come out with a lot of those outcomes. But I think there's going to be motivation for Georgia. I know this may sound odd to think about, but I think this is the prime of Kirby Smart's career at Georgia. I think these next 4 to 5 seasons will really determine whether he is an all-time Rushmore coach in college football. He has the potential to get there with 2 national championships in his 8 seasons so far and another near miss. I think this roster will largely be built in terms of, is this guy, are we bringing in guys that can make, in Brandon's terms, the Death Star without a thermal exhaust port program in college football? I think that's what the tantalizing aspect of pursuing Julian Lewis is. It's simply the best guy. Is it going to be complicated? Is it going to be figuring out NIL? Is it going to be figuring out periphery NIL? I think that might be a path outside of the collective where separate individual companies add to the bank there, much like Caleb Williams got with different mass marketing franchises in the South Carolina and Southern California area. I think that's what could happen with Julian Lewis. But I think, again, if I want to put this in the right perspective, Georgia's chances of having 2 or 3 amazing quarterbacks in the room for 2025 and 2026 aren't as strong as they were a couple of days ago.
So let me ask you this, Connor. I think a year ago when Dylan Raiola chose Nebraska, we certainly had a reaction to it, but I didn't really view that as a must-win recruitment for Georgia. Carson Beck was coming back. There was a lot of depth in the quarterback room of young talents that I thought were, close to what, Dylan Raiola could be. Obviously, Brock Vandegrift's no longer there. My question is, if you would stipulate, as I just did, that, Raiola a year ago wasn't a must-win, is a 2025 quarterback now a must-win because you didn't win one a year ago? Or is, the idea of a clear plan of succession going in the direction of Gunnar Stockton enough of a luxury that this isn't a must-win either? And perhaps Georgia doesn't truly face a must-win quarterback recruiting battle until 2026. And obviously Jared Curtis is in the fold there, for what that's worth, right now. Like, if this isn't must-win for Georgia at quarterback in this class, when does Georgia kind of face a must-win recruiting scenario at quarterback again?
I don't know that, because I think you look at the way Georgia has gone about developing quarterbacks here, and Juju Lewis, I think if you remove the NIL and the desire to play early, I think he fits a lot of what Georgia really likes in its quarterbacks in terms of playing at a high level, in-state kid. Attracts a lot of high-end guys, but you look at the guys that they've had success with at the quarterback position and Kirby Smart. Obviously, Jake Fromm, upper-tier quarterback. He was not the number 1 quarterback in his class with Davis Mills and Tua Tagovailoa, but certainly higher ranked than Stetson Bennett was, who anybody could have had multiple times during his college career. Higher ranked than Carson Beck ended up being, because Carson fell over the course of his recruitment, in large part because he just did not have the same senior season that I think a lot of other quarterbacks in that 2020 cycle ended up having. Gunnar Stockton doesn't do camps, and because of that, he ends up falling in the recruiting rankings. And then Ryan Puglisi, because of the fact that he's more often than not playing against Connecticut kids and prep schoolers up there in the Dorchester area, I think there, his quarterback drops. But look, Georgia's gotten really good quarterback play consistently over the time of Kirby Smart's tenure here. You'd think 2016 and I think large stretches of 2020 have been the only times that hasn't been the case. And also, I'll point out, every single 5-star quarterback that Kirby Smart has had come through this program, Jacob Eason, Justin Fields, Brock Vandegrift, and JT Daniels, if you're willing to count him from when he transferred in, have all ended up transferring out. And so I think it's important to keep in mind here a couple of different things, as BA touched on. Is there such thing as a must-win quarterback battle? I don't think there is, because I think Kirby Smart maybe perhaps doesn't get the credit he deserves for this, in part, I think, so much because of the way the Fields Fromm thing played out all those years ago. They've done a really good job of identifying quarterbacks and developing quarterbacks. And so, whether or not NFL or whatnot, sure, you can make whatever point you want to make. Jake Fromm was a very good college quarterback. Stetson Bennett was a very good college quarterback. Carson Beck has shown the potential to be a very good college quarterback. And so because of that, I think, there is this idea that, Georgia can afford to go after the guy that they want. I'll also add in there, look, Georgia's recruiting philosophy at a lot of other positions on the field is they want to hit home runs in recruiting every year. They want to land the top guys at their position. They wanted to do that with Dylan Raiola last year, and they just didn't end up getting him. They wanted to do it with Arch Manning in 2023. They didn't end up getting him. Juju Lewis, I think, is now in that same boat of, I think he's Georgia's top guy. I think Georgia, has seen him as the top guy. I think Georgia, because of the possibility that they could one day land Juju Lewis, is part of the reason why I don't think Matt Zollers is coming here. And that's not stone cold fact. I think Georgia has made it clear that, we're going to take big swings at the quarterback position. And look, we might not land them, but we've also shown that we know what we're doing at the quarterback position and can figure it out in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I find to be interesting, Jeff, is that I think it might be easier to raise 10x dollars for Julian Lewis than it might be to raise X dollars for Matt Zollers, because Zollers is from Pennsylvania. I don't want to say nobody knows him, but broadly speaking, the average rich guy doesn't really know as much about Matt Zollers as he might know about a 5-star in Carrollton who's on TV a lot.
I pronounced his name until today. Right.
Yeah. We pronounced his name correctly until 5 minutes ago. I just think that there could be a play here where, if it is about NIL, it could perhaps be easier to raise a larger sum for Lewis because it creates a little bit more natural excitement than someone like Zollers, who people I respect, including you, Jeff, have kind of raved about his quarterback ability, but he probably doesn't move the needle as much for money back booster as the guy in state probably does.
I think what's happening there, guys, is, Kirby has become to me, and I don't know if this is 100% the way I feel, but it kind of grows a little bit more year by year. I think Georgia has reached the point. Brandon, you remember when we started doing these shows years ago where the player asset, the high value player asset was needed to come in and help make Georgia what everybody wanted it to be. I feel in a lot of cases right now, the Georgia machine makes these players into these NFL prospects. It's iron on iron. It's each other. It's maybe this quarterback isn't the highest bid winner on the market, but he's a guy that after he goes through 3 or 4 years of practice grind against 15, 25 other NFL players on defense, they acquire the ability. They get better. They get used to it. They up their game because they need it to be able to get on the field at Georgia. I think that's more the case. I think Kirby Smart, to use some dad metaphors, I guess, here a little bit. He's that guy that you're in the car lot and you're in there and you're in the closing manager's office, and then the final numbers come out. Kirby's willing to walk away from a prospect that he doesn't feel he want to compromise his principles on. I think Georgia has a lot of situations in the near future where they're going to have to see, is the way we built these 2 championships the way we're going to build championships 4, 5, and 6? And that may mean compromising on some of those old values or those old kind of staples that they're looking for, or maybe their best practices. But I don't know, Connor and Brandon, I don't know if quarterback's the spot where they will do that. I think we've already seen the purse strings lessened a lot on the offensive line and defensive line. I think they're probably going to come to a really strong foothold about maybe wide receivers that position, because if they can't get the high dollar quarterback, then maybe they can get the players that make the quarterback shine a lot brighter. A very smart football mind. I had this conversation with him that knows the intricacies of the Georgia football program. He told me, he said, all this talk about quarterbacks, they need to worry about getting the receivers that make the quarterback look superhuman. And I think that's probably, if I had to sit there and rub the magic 8 ball and think about what Georgia quarterback or Georgia recruiting at all looks like in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, to stay at the top of the heap. And we know Georgia's always going to have a top 3, top 4 class no matter what. The top of the heat. I think maybe NIL policies will have to change a little bit, but I don't know if it's strictly at the quarterback position.
So very late in the show, I'm going to play devil's advocate here just for a minute. And I don't mean to I'm not trying to be too critical, but there is an element to which some of Georgia's quarterback success has been sheer luck. They had no idea how good Stetson Bennett was. I mean, they weren't really practicing.
Multiple times.
Yeah. They ran him out of town over and over again. They weren't practicing him prior to 2020. They weren't really practicing him prior to 2021. And he just sort of stepped up and became this historic figure in the program. That is an example of a player that fell into their lap. And I think there's a chance that Carson Beck has also turned out to be a better player than they probably imagined he would have been circa 2020, circa 2021. I would say that is something that they have been the beneficiary of. So, back in 2018 when Justin Fields and Jake Fromm was here, Kirby's line at the time was the plan is there is no plan. I think that Smart was just sort of being flippant when he said that. I don't think he necessarily meant that, but it's important to have a plan. And you can't always just depend on a movie, level legend just sort of falling to your lap the way that it did in the Stetson Bennett era, or a potential number 1 overall pick, certainly possible first-round pick, falling into your lap the way that it has with Carson Beck, who was kind of ranked outside the top 200 and sat here for several years and, finally was patient and is making good on his opportunity. I would say that's a certain example of back-to-back players providing you some good fortune that you can't always count on. You better have a little bit more of a concrete plan for the next version of Bennett or Beck in this program. Maybe that's Stockton, and maybe that buys you some time. But you can't always just count on somebody just sort of magically emerging, because a lot of programs can tell you about when that doesn't happen.
But see, Brandon, that's what I kind of think is happening there. When I made that point about Georgia making prospects, I don't think that Carson Beck and Stetson Bennett were eggs that needed to be hatched and needed to be matriculated over the years. I think, or like, break glass in case you have a quarterback problem. I think the Georgia way, the Georgia methods allowed them to really take a lot of lumps on the practice field in year 1, year 2, and year 3. And then all by the sudden that they've been kind of galvanized by what it's like to have to practice against Georgia's machine on defense year in and year out. They become something much greater than they possibly ever would be, because they may still stink on the practice field and not be what Kirby Smart wants. But then when he faces a Mizzou defense or a Kentucky defense or a South Carolina defense that only has like 4 or 5 future NFL players on their whole side of the defensive ball, they become a lot better. They function a lot better. They play a lot better. And that's going to win them a lot of football games. I think sometimes the slow marination of pretty good football players allow them to be outstanding players in the SEC, or at least get very strong quarterback play in the SEC, no matter what they were rated, no matter what they came in for, and no matter how much NIL it cost.
One thing I will touch on what Brandon talked about there. I do think that this news and the continued sort of, okay, what happens here with the 2025 quarterback thing, it puts a lot more onto the plate of Gunnar Stockton in terms of how he goes about developing. Because if he continues to develop and I think makes a jump similar to what Carson Beck did during the 2022 season, where he was Georgia's primary backup, and let's be frank, got a lot better that season so that there was some real confidence going into the 2023 season. If you see something like that out of Gunnar Stockton this year, I think that's very encouraging for what the future of the Georgia quarterback position looks like, because that at least gets you to 2025 and potentially through 2026, because in all likelihood, Gunnar fits the profile of someone who is going to be around for 2 more years. And by that point, again, Jared Curtis will be here, and a lot of this won't necessarily be the same level there. So regardless of what happens and what Georgia ends up doing in the 2025 cycle, I do think that the development of Gunnar Stockton has only been heightened because of this. And Jeff, you touched on this earlier. How does a transfer portal quarterback, which I think we all sit here and assume they might go out and do, how does that impact the future of this position, and specifically Gunnar Stockton? Because I think Gunnar's the type of kid and player that he's not going to worry about anyone else out there. He believes in himself enough to where he is the best option. But that's certainly going to be a factor into this. And if Gunnar Stockton's able to give you some things, I think, and you feel comfortable that he's going to be Georgia's next starting quarterback, I think that goes a long way in assuaging some of the concerns that you have with Georgia quarterback recruiting in this 2025 cycle.
2 more quick points I'd like to make is, one, I know that Bobo family story very well with Gunnar Stockton. There was a time his father, George Bobo, was Gunnar's primary quarterback tutor for years. Mike knew about Gunnar. I'm pretty sure that Mike probably looked at Gunnar at one point in his life, heard about him from his dad, and probably said, that kid who's already throwing the ball 40, 50 yards at age 6 could be my Aaron Murray. I do believe those sort of thoughts have been in Mike Bobo's head at one point. And for a transfer portal quarterback that Mike Bobo probably hadn't seen his film until 4 months ago, to try to get that head start and jump past Gunnar, that might be a may the best man win situation, but good luck to you, especially if Gunnar's been at Georgia for so long and Georgia knows what it can and cannot do. The other thing, I know there's a lot of hemming and hawing that Georgia took one of those Drinkwitz L's on the recruiting trail, but they win them all in September and October and November. Let's be clear about this one point, because I think this point, I needed to make this a little bit earlier in our conversation. And that is, Georgia wasn't even in the quarterback business whatsoever for the 2025 class until the middle of December. And Georgia listen, people think NIL, it can be done. It is still recruiting at ludicrous speed with a quarterback to be able to go from zero. Because why were they not in the 2025 quarterback business? We all know this. I want to make sure everybody watching knows this. That's because they were going to get Puglisi and Raiola in the middle of December, and they weren't actively recruiting 2025s at all. And then all of a sudden it is a hard stop. Let's go fast forward. They didn't even offer Zollers until the middle of January in 2024. So I think this was a way that the Georgia name could get them in the top 4 and in the final 2 of any quarterback it wants to. But again, this was a situation that Georgia really wasn't planning for, in a way that you have to really recruit quarterbacks for years in order to be able to land them.
Was the ludicrous speed, was that a reference to Spaceballs, the 1980s parody movie classic? Was that a reference to Spaceballs?
Brandon, we got too many people yelling this out for all our multiple Star Wars references. Like, we're always you know, we choose the number one mega franchise. That was for all those Rick Moranis fans out there.
There you go.
I'll just say this, Kaylee Mansell, we have our show on Thursday night. I made a very obvious Few Good Men reference. Totally went over her head. So I will gladly take Spaceballs and Star Wars references all day long. I think that's a good point to wrap up. We've gone about 40 minutes here touching on a bunch of different things when it comes to the quarterback position for Georgia. Big news of the day, Matt Zollers commits to Missouri. Georgia, other names out there. However, if you're looking for good Georgia news, you might not have to wait too long. I think Jeff Sentell is going to hand deliver that for us tomorrow, along with maybe being a guest on DawgNation Daily potentially. We'll see. Big day to monitor there on Friday. But the big news today: Matt Zollers commits to Missouri. Georgia still looking for its quarterback in the 2025 class. For Jeff Sentell and Brandon Adams, my name is Connor Riley, and this has been a DawgNation production.